Ladies and gentlemen, let us commence today's panel discussion session with a soulful rendition of our national preamble, which encapsulates the essence of our Constitution and the values that our nation cherishes. Let us join together in listening and pledge to uphold these principles. I now request our school choir to present a preamble song. Meanwhile, I request everyone to raise as a mark of respect. Please be seated. Thank you, students, for your wonderful presentation. Good morning, everyone. I am Mrs. Premila D'Souza and delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion session. Today, we gather to explore the transformative power of empathy, compassion, and kindness in creating a more inclusive and compassionate world. Our esteemed panelists will share their insights and expertise on how we can elevate humanity through small actions, systematic changes, and collective efforts. As we navigate the complexities of our modern world, it's clear that we need to prioritize empathy and understanding. This discussion is a call to action, inviting us to reflect on our individual and collective roles in creating a brighter future for all. Now, may I invite our panelists, Dr. Rajaram Tholpady, Dr. Neeta Inamdar, Dr. Archana Bhatt, Dr. Ashok Kamath, and the moderator of the session, Mr. Shubhankar Paul, to the dais. I request everyone to welcome them with a big round of applause. you, dear panelist. Our esteemed panelist, Dr. Ashok Kamath, will be joining us shortly. He has an urgent commitment that he made to attend. Legends need no introduction. It's true indeed. Today, we are privileged to have distinguished speakers amongst us, and it is my pleasure to introduce them to this august gathering. At first, let me introduce our panelist, Dr. Rajaram Tolpadi, to this gathering. Professor Rajaram Tolpadi is a former professor in the Department of Political Science at Mangalore University, Mangala Gangotri. He served as a director in charge of the Nehru Study Center at Mangalore University from 2017 to 2023. He pursued a PhD from Mangalore University and an MA in Political Science from Banaras Hindu University. His research focuses on political theory, modern Indian political philosophy, Indian politics, nationalism, secularism, democracy, and identity politics. He has completed a UGC major research project titled Communal Politics in Coastal Karnataka 2009-12. He is also served as a visiting fellow at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, where he conducted postdoctoral research on Hindutva politics in coastal Karnataka from 2003 to 2005. It is with great pride I share his notable publication, which comprise significant works in both Kannada and English languages, towards an understanding of third sector in India, the dynamics of Hindutva politics on democracy and civil society in India. I have the honor to extend a most cordial and hearty welcome to you, sir. May I request Mrs. Merida D. Almeida, the former principal of SMS English Medium School, to present a bouquet and the welcome card to the speaker as a token of respect. Thank you, madam, for your kind gesture. Let me introduce one of our renowned panelists for the day, Dr. Neeta Inamdar, to this esteemed gathering. Dr. Neeta Inamdar is a renowned academic and researcher, currently serving as a research professor at Symbiosis International University, where she is establishing Center for Higher Education Research and Policy of Advocacy. She is on sabbatical from her position as Jean Monnet Professor at the Manipal Center for European Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Dr. Inamdar has made significant contribution to the field of higher education and policy, particularly in internalization, India-EU engagement, and cross-border education. She has edited 3 books on these topics and has been involved in various multidisciplinary research projects. Dr. Inamdar has also played a key role in policy initiatives such as TRIP 2020 and has collaborated with UNESCO on revising recommendation on education for international understanding and cooperation. Additionally, Dr. Inamdar serves as the chief editor of Manipal Universal Press, which has published over 2,050 academic work across various disciplines. On behalf of everyone present here, I extend a genial welcome to you, ma'am. May I request Mrs. Srilata Rao, the principal of Dr. M. Ramanna Shetty Memorial English Medium High School, to do the honor to our renowned panelist. Thank you, madam, for your loving gesture. I am elated to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Archana Bhatt, to this gathering. Dr. Archana Bhatt is a seasoned psychologist and educator, a strong background in teaching, research, and administration. Currently, she serves as an associate professor and head of the psychology department at Katil Ashokbai Memorial Institute of Allied Health Sciences, Shimoga. Her expertise spans curriculum development, evaluation coordination, and mentoring students. Dr. Archana's research focus lies in psychosocial and clinical domains with quantitative research and psychometric tool development. She has made significant contribution to various projects, including the development of a semi-projective psychometric test for children. Her publications appear in reputable journals covering topics such as pet attachment, mental health, gender attitudes, and internal addiction. Dr. Archana pursued a PhD in psychology from the University of Mysore and has authored and edited books, organized workshops, and has been invited as speaker at academic events. She is a proficient in multiple languages and skilled in data analysis software like SPSS, making her a valuable asset to the field of psychology and education. I am truly delighted to welcome you, Madam. May I request Mrs. Radha Prabhu, the Principal Dr. N. Shankar Adhyantya Memorial English Medium School, Nitte, to do the floral welcome to our panelists. Thank you, Madam, for your cheerful welcome. I am very happy to introduce Mr. Shubhankar Paul, the moderator of the season, to the gathering. Shubhankar Paul is a PhD scholar at the Center for European Studies, MAHE, Manipal, where he is developing an Indian model of higher education with a global educational discourse, with a background in European and South European studies, including an Erasmus Mundus joint master's degree. Shubhankar brings a multicultural perspective to his research. He possesses expertise in qualitative research, academic writing, and public relations, and has been awarded prestigious scholarships such as the Erasmus Mundus Scholarship and the UE India Think Tank's Twinning Initiative. Leveraging his skills and experience, Shubhankar facilitates discussion on education, culture, and international relations, contributing to the development of a more inclusive and globalized educational landscape. On behalf of everyone gathered here, I extend a cordial welcome to you, sir. May I request ICE Secretary, Mrs. Geeta Shashidhar, to do the floral welcome to our moderator of today's session. Thank you, Madam, for your kind gesture. I am certain that each of you will take away the valuable insights from this session. So, without further ado, let's begin the session. Over to the panelists.
Okay. Hello. Good morning, everyone. We have the honor of being the first panel to start discussions on the theme of elevating humanity and in the context of education. So I would like to say a few things before we officially get into the deep discussion. One is that many of us, I think almost all of us on this panel come from higher education. But we all know and are very well aware that any discussion on higher education is incomplete without the school. So it's great that we are having this conference here in a school and we are discussing education, all aspects of education, but great that it's happening in a school because this is where the foundations of any philosophy, any principles, or any administrative policies regarding education first find their fertile ground. So thank you for organizing this. And secondly, I think education itself, as we all understand, becomes very multidisciplinary. We'll get into the discussion and I'll ask my panelists as well if they feel education is a discipline on its own. Because as you can see, and as we will see, disciplines of all kinds contribute to the discourse on this very beautiful topic of education. So why I say that is because with this, probably we will try to navigate our discussion today in this panel. I will ask all my panelists to contextualize the contemporary discourse in education through their disciplinary lenses. Because I think the higher education, school education divide and the disciplinary divide, all of this needs to be somehow bridged when we are talking about education, humanity, everything. So without further ado, I'll probably get started with the discussion. And I would like to start with Professor Inamdar. Based on your interests based on your areas of research and work, and also your discipline, how do you contextualize today's debate on education and humanity? And this will be a question for all of you as you answer. How do you make sense? So the title of our session is Rethinking Education, Multiple Perspectives for a Compassionate Future. How do you see a compassionate future? You, Anita Inamdar.
Okay. So you want me to speak sitting here or you want me to go there? Whatever is, I'm comfortable here or there.
No.
It's fine?
They should all listen to this.
All right.
Yeah.
So good morning, all the educators here. It's a privilege to be here and share a few ideas about what I feel needs an immediate response when it comes to education today and what bothers me the most. So if you look around, we see a lot of violence, we see a lot of battles of ideas, of words, of opinions, and a lot of behavioral challenges that we see amongst people. I'm saying people, it can be from any age group, from very young to very old. The problem of the way people think and act, both. So when it comes to thinking and acting, and most of it happening across people with or without formal education. So my question is, if these are people who are coming with a formal education, is there something that we have done not very right in terms of inculcating values, in terms of moral behavior, ethical thinking? How much time have we devoted to moral literacy? So most often, even when we look at most of the reports that are generated by the government, we are thinking in terms of literacy, we are thinking in terms of numeracy. You look for it and you will find data. I am not going into data at this point. But how about moral literacy? Have we thought through about moral literacy as an idea, as educators? I remember when I go back to my school days, we had one moral education class per week. And because there are a lot of school leaders here, I'm just placing it before you to think and maybe come out with some options. We had only one moral education period in a week, 3 physical education periods, and of course all through the day mathematics, science, social science, English, Hindi, Sanskrit, of course other subjects. One class of 45 minutes per week, only on moral education. And generally any teacher who was not very occupied or free was asked to engage that class. And that teacher used to come to class and say, if you have any homework not completed, any classwork not completed, complete it. Here is your time. Is that the importance we are according to moral education? So what is the status? Is that why we are the way we are? I felt one good thing just in the break before this session, we went to toilet. All teachers, they were all very neatly queued up. But that is not a scenario you find in many places. We as a community, we are not even ready to queue up where we are supposed to. There is a lot of road rash. We easily jump signals and proudly speak about it, we are corrupt, many of us. I'm saying for larger mass, I'm not talking about one or other individual. But we call ourselves a collectivist society, right? I mean, particularly most of the Asian societies, we call ourselves a collectivist society. Are we really collective if we cannot leave a toilet seat clean behind for the next person or the next user? These are like small little things. From such things to having corruption in high offices, we are faced with very severe moral problems in the society. And as educationists, are we doing enough for that? This is my major problem. Then maybe if we look at this particular paper by Nancy Tuana, okay, she gives this conceptualization of moral literacy, very beautifully putting across. So she says this entire moral literacy can be broken down into 3 things. So one is ethics sensitivity, another is ethical reasoning skills, and moral imagination. So are we bringing these things to our classroom discussions at primary level, even at pre-primary level? It's possible. We discuss the rights and wrongs, the do's and don'ts. Of course, there is a way, and I'm sure the teachers here are trained how to approach a particular learning level. So when you say ethics sensitivity, are we able to make sense of whether a situation is really ethical? Is there an ethical question involved when we come across a particular question? Second is about the awareness of moral intensity of that situation. And that moral intensity of a situation can be gauged based on the impact a breach of that moral, that particular decision has on people around us. So that moral intensity becomes something very significant. Are we able to help people, or are we able to do it by ourselves? Are we able to judge the moral intensity of a situation and also the moral virtues or the values that underlie a situation? Are we able to help students with those? So I'm not going into the moral challenges that we as adults face, but maybe as students face. And then when it comes to ethical reasoning skills, this is also, somebody spoke in the morning about critical thinking faculties, developing critical thinking faculties. Are we able to do that? So when it comes to critical thinking faculties, we are talking about understanding ethical frameworks in the first place, and collecting and assessing the facts related to that as a second step. And then maybe ability to identify and assess the values involved. For example, I mean, this is more a construct that I am presenting because they are all senior teachers and senior academic leaders. But if you have to take an example, what kind of frameworks are we providing students with? For example, a student copies from someone else and comes to you and submits an assignment. And you know it is copied. So in what ethical framework are we able to discuss this? And there is no point in just punishing a student. Most often what we do, okay, I'm going to give you 0 points on 0 marks for this assignment. Is that a response? Or do we engage with this student and tell him or her, how do you assess your own behavior when it came to this? How do you assess your own action? So are we able to discuss the ethical frameworks? One is the consequentialist ethics. Consequentialist ethics is when we are speaking in terms of consequences. So you want somebody to behave ethically, because otherwise there are consequences of it that he or she is faced with. Is that what we are going to tell? See, if you don't do this, I'm going to deduct points from it, or you're going to be debarred, you're going to be whatever, right? That is one. Or are we looking at deontological ethics, which is more based on the responsibilities? It's based on somebody. You are supposed to be honest. You are in a school environment. You're not supposed to lie to your teachers. And therefore, it's your responsibility to be honest. And therefore, don't do this. Or is there something like virtue ethics? Virtue ethics is to be truthful is a virtue. And therefore, you discuss this idea. And these virtues generally are very context specific, cultural specific. Every culture has its own set of virtues. And based on that, we enable a student not just to understand those virtues, but also engage with it, bring it into action, and also understand that these virtue ethics can be different in different cultures. So that's what multiculturalism is all about, right? And are we able to have this kind of a discussion with a student? And therefore, I feel moral literacy is something that we as teachers need to be equipped in the first place, and then take it to our classrooms. As school leaders, I feel you provide more space for this kind of discussions, and it doesn't have to be only in a moral education class. That's the biggest problem. We think moral education has to be limited to moral education class. No. Can we embed it in different subjects that are taught, in different courses that are taught to students? Can that be embedded, even including physical education? When you are on a ground, when you are playing with the fellow students, are you able to give that adequate space to everyone? And victory or loss is taken gracefully. So it can be everywhere. And if we are not able to do, then I think I call your attention to moral literacy. And because I don't want to take a lot of time of other panels, I hand it over back to Shubhankar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Namdar. I think I agree. It's one of the biggest debates of our times, and has been always there, I feel, because the more we read about it, it turns out that ethical questions have been pervading discourse on education in the West, in India, all the time. Based on that, because we are still on the topic of compassionate future, moral literacy, I feel a good segue would be to go into the psychology domain first, and then we'll come to politics and practice in a while, sir. Okay? So I am accused sometimes of favoring the ladies a bit more, but trust me, this is only about the disciplines right now. So, ma'am, Archana, Dr. Bhatt, why don't you tell us a bit about how psychology informs the current debates in education, and what do you think of a compassionate future? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Respected fellow panelists, and Gurubhyo Namaha, because all teachers sitting over here are the sculptors of today and tomorrow. When I speak here, I do not speak only as a psychologist, I also speak as an educator and a researcher. And my experience in working with adults who obviously have gone through your hands and come to us. When I talk about education, as Mr. Paul mentioned, we do have many challenges. Let us first try to understand what is the age group that we are talking about. We are talking about young 6-year-olds who come into the formal education till around 16-year-olds who leave us after their 12th grade. So we are talking about this population when we are talking about school education. Now, when we look at behavior, we have the psychosocial biological model to look into. One reality comes with a biological model, that is, in terms of their behavior development, there is something called, I usually tell this, when we do a mistake, we say IO, right? We usually hit the right side of our forehead and we tell IO. And scientifically, if you go to look at it, it is just not a coincidence. This is also a prefrontal cortex, which is associated with our conscious behavior of taking conscious decisions and our problem solving, where we talk about consequences and the awareness of my actions and its consequences. So this part to completely mature takes around 21 years. So when we are talking about our school children who come under us, we are talking about a population which is biologically still not mature enough to take conscious, consequence, awareness, having decisions. So we are talking about that population. And unfortunately, we push these kids to take decisions about their future. We ask them to, I'm just looking at the time because I don't want to step into anyone else's time. We are talking about children who are not aware of this. That is why right from the beginning when they're young, you see that there is a difference, especially as they enter teen. There is a problematic behavior, not just in someone else's kid who studies in my school, but also my own kid. We see risk-taking behavior increases, defiance increases, rebelliousness, questioning of a non-productive type sometimes increases, and taking decisions which they would probably repent later on. And at this age, we ask them to take, okay, tell you want to take science, arts. And by the way, when I'm talking today, I'm talking about majority popular education that we are looking into today, because that is where we have the maximum population studying under. And we have this. So let us understand that very few children, now when we are talking about psychosocial, biologically all children are the same. So when we are talking, then why is it that some students understand and some students don't understand in the sense of their awareness? What makes some more mature and some not? Then obviously the psychosocial part. How has the family been with them? How much of autonomy is given to them to take an accountability of their actions? How much of discussion goes into the family? How much open are we, especially considering that India is quite conservative when it comes to sexual talk at home, education related to sexuality and all these things. And even when it comes to career choice or educational choice, how much of feedback goes in? Because usually when we have counseling, career counseling, how much ever we do the interest profiling and we do the personality and the aptitude profiling, later on when we have the counseling with the parent usually say, we keep telling mathematical ability illa, kadme ide, athwa spatial ability illa. Engineering madre sari hotogatala, madam. I'm precisely telling you, please don't do this. And here we have the child and the parent. Now the interest is what the child is exposed to. So child has been fed telling engineering mado. So when we look at the interest profiling, we see this. And in spite of us giving a feedback, because in counseling you cannot tell you shouldn't do this. So we very subtly present to them, telling that probably your child should not. It might be difficult. The child will have challenges. Hangade mechanical, but reasoning ability no kadme ide. IT hakbirtini, madam. So they are hell-bent on certain things which they are, very strong about. Now we have challenges because we are dealing with children who probably are not 100% capable of taking their decisions and ownership to their decisions. That is why in higher education, because I come from a background where I worked in rural, tier 2 and metropolitan city. I have worked in my PhD is on children, and then I worked in engineering college and then moved over to pure psychology. And engineering colleges, 7 children have come up to me and said, ma'am, I want to quit engineering. And this is an engineering college where probably if you have a payment seat, you will be paying around 30 to 40 lakhs. And then in the 7th sem, 8 is where they go out. they say, ma'am, I don't think I want to do this. Now, I wonder if they have been guided through their early education, where they have been shown different things, where they have been given a chance to have critical thinking, trying to analyze that there are other facets other than what I am aware of. Can I explore it? So this is one thing that I see as a huge challenge, because ultimately, when it comes to education, we have two choices predominantly in India. One is it going to be employment-based, or is it going to be critical thinking? Now, when we are talking about employment, we go with employment skills. And with that goes marks. So sometimes employment can be because of marks. Sometimes employment can be because of skills. But do we have the critical skills, problem-solving abilities, decision-making abilities? Because again, we have a very populistic idea that system sari illa India dalli. Do we have an alternative for the huge population we have? We do understand in Europe and in most of the West, the numbers in your classroom is less. The number of children seeking admission is less. It is okay, I can have Viva. Imagine if you have around 5,000 children in your school, can you have Viva and can you have demonstration for all the children? And how many evaluators can be trained to do this? Given that we have a semester in which we have to finish the portions and we also have to finish the evaluation. Let us assume even if we take continuous evaluation, is it practically possible for us to continuously do this? Because ideology, one side, we also have to understand practicality, that if we are going to change the system, it has to be a massive thing which starts right from the beginning. Unfortunately, in Karnataka, NEP was started only for the higher education. And that brings us to the next point. Do we really have interdisciplinary studies? I study this subject, I study that subject, and I am not taught how do I integrate these two subjects. So can I have interdisciplinary studies, which is a dream for most of us, because right from day one, the day I understand that I sit in the class, I know social is different, I know science is different, math is different, English is different, Kannada is different. Have I ever been given a chance to integrate all these things? So multidisciplinary study does not happen overnight. Even though NEP, that was one of the main reasons that NEP collapsed in Karnataka. And now we are back to SEP, simply because you did have open elective, adik tale buda inyadukku sambandha illa, and I have not been taught how to integrate these subjects so that I can have a wider range of thinking. Now if I'm doing computer science and they give me psychology, I ask students, what did you learn? Ma'am, ist marks bantu. Allah, what did you learn? I don't have an answer for that. Even when it was NEP where I was given a chance to study something else. Why don't you come up with an idea? Okay, you teach this, but in skill enhancement, I am taught how do I integrate these things. And even when it comes to employment, as a psychologist, my college is, I come from Katil Ashok Pai Memorial College, which is associated with a psychiatric hospital. It is run, my managing trustees are from the hospital. And during the research, we see that there is a lot of psychosomatizations, pain, in around this 28 to 35 age group who come to our hospital. And most of these come from agricultural background. So when you are talking about psychosomatic pains, there is no bodily proof of any sort of problem in your body, but they come with back pain, and they come with neck pain, abdominal pain, asthma, eczema, headaches, migraines are very common. And when there is a lot of investigation which takes place, there's nothing bodily wrong with them. And that is where I thought, let me take a research grant for this and see, do we find some sort of pattern? And most of these people, men and women, came from educated backgrounds, not being employed in the field of education that they have studied, but are from agricultural backgrounds. That means they have studied something else, not gained any skill about their livelihood, The parents are still around, so agriculture is going on. Then the parent says, get married, nodko nin tota na iga, or take care of the business. I have no clue what it is. I do not know what a subsidy is. I do not know what an agricultural loan is. I have no clue about how the horticulture department works or anything of that sort. And here, when the responsibility is put on their heads, here we have an individual who is totally incapable of taking care of the business or the livelihood, even though the person has been educated for almost 20 plus years. So the next question is, what is education? If a person is not able to survive healthily, what is education? The next question that we have is education versus my own belief and my culture. Sometimes Kantara was a huge reason for debate. I'm not telling it's a good movie, bad movie, or support it or anything. And the whole thing was why. And then when we had discussions, my students who study masters in psychology, they said, ma'am, this is one question we wanted to ask you for a long time. I come from Malnad, I'm from Tirthahalli, and the hospital where we have is Shimoga. We have a lot of cases where schizophrenic patients come with Brahma, Naga, Chaudi as hallucinations and delusions. And my students ask me, ma'am, if that is their hallucination and delusion, what is their belief? Because right from when I am young, my family has taught me, Mane lena ruk kal dhodre, you lose something, you keep one tengina kai to Chaudi, and Chaudi will take care. Or you do Brahman Puja and your whole property is taken care of. And here I come to the hospital, if I believe in Brahma, Naga, Chaudi, you have schizophrenia. So is the education questioning my belief, because my belief is giving me some sort of social security, telling that, okay, there's something wrong, someone is not well, I keep harmless. If you were to define superstition, it is harmless. Superstition is something that is harmful. So this is harmless. You keep one tengina kai, it is not disturbing anyone. It is giving you some sort of, I usually tell my students, counseling is not where you break down the native framework and put your framework. You strengthen the native framework in a way that they are enabled and empowered. Now the next question is our education breaking the native framework and the native belief in the process or in the name of modern education? Is our modern education disturbing the peace that we have already had in the name of progressive education? So this is another question that I would want to have. And then the next one is, of late, the rise in different problems, mental health related problems, right from we have as young as probably 4th to 5th. This is purely from a psychological point of view as a counselor that I'm talking about. We have clients coming from 4th, 6th, 4th and 5th standard, and PU, all this very common with us, technology related. Now, two things, stress. WHO itself has accepted information overload has become a major cause for stress in everyone. So I have so much of information in my hand, what do I do about this? And do I choose this, do I choose that? So just to see how it works, I had my first year MScs and my second year MScs, and I gave them open book tests. Now when we talk about open book tests, I sent my first year MScs to the library, no phones, no computer. I told, this is what you're going to write, you have 2 hours, sent them to the library. And then I got my second MScs, told them, you have your laptops, you have the Wi-Fi connection, you have your mobiles, this is your question paper, you also have 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, I got my library group. They were very happy. And their answers were more, planned, and their answers were more to the point. And then here I have my Wi-Fi enabled group, which said, ma'am, innond sali itara test kodbedi. because there's so much of information, and we have the blogs, we have Wikipedia. Wikipedia is probably one of the worst sources of information. I can edit it, you can edit it, anyone can edit it. And then there's so many things over there. Ma'am, I don't know if it is true because there's so much of contradiction. Ma'am, there's so many research papers. Gone to ChatGPT. ChatGPT, unless you have a paid version, not reliable. It will give you all sorts of nonsense. Even to use AI, you need to be intelligent. You need to be intelligent in what commands you give. That's why I said, sometimes we feel, do we go, just tell, no, don't use technology. They are going to use technology. How do we safely use technology? We have to use AI. How do? Okay, Perplexity.ai is relatively better because it brings out real research documents. It gives you real sources. ChatGPT, you pay money. Gemini is comparatively better, but Gemini also has a problem. If it picks up things from blogs which are unreliable, the data is unreliable. If it picks it up from probably reliable research papers, then it is. So AI, the smarter we are, smarter is the AI. So in education, probably I have to be smart enough that I as a teacher know how to use AI and technology smartly, and I teach my students. And then that border, that boundary, where do I stop? Because again, coming back to critical thinking. When I have ready-made answers, where AI chooses and gives me answers, where is my critical thinking? Where is my reasoning? And if I'm completely dependent on this, then where do I go as an adult, educated citizen? I am not capable. AI is capable. Who has graduated? AI has graduated. I have just got my marks. Other than that, do I have anything else? And safe use of technology. Coming to the younger adults, I'm sure teachers have a lot of questions related to writing skills. Post-COVID, we have had a lot of problem with writing skills. We get series and series of students. We are not certified to do learning disability assessment, but we screen them so that we can send them to All India Institute of Speech and Hearing or NIMHANS for certification. And we see that writing skills, both in the native language and English, is bad. Similarly, expression of any sort is bad. Now it is easy to tell, children don't use the phone, this, that, everything. But as educators, have we stopped sending PDFs? If I'm sending PDFs online, if I'm studying reading material to the WhatsApp groups, aren't we pushing them into the world of phones again? Because again, this isn't completely mature. The child doesn't know where to stop. In addition to your PDF, child will open other things also. So as educators, where do we stop? Can we go back to books and writing? This is something that is again troubling us, and obviously as very young children, we have this continuous problem of technology-induced autism. I'm sure all of you know about autism, and here we have had more than 25% rise in autism cases in our Child Guidance Center, and these things are all related to early, screen time, and especially during feeding. Socialization has been affected, social skills are affected. If we are talking about marks, then what do we do with the marks if they are unemployed because they do not have the social skills necessary for employment, do not have necessary interpersonal skills? So the list goes on and on, but I would like to stop here because we can have a discussion about this later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhatt. Actually, out of both the opening remarks from Dr. Inamdar as well as you, I see one thing emerging. Making a choice is where critical thinking is, where we have to use a lot of frameworks, skills, which is becoming the center stage of discussion. And some choices could also be related to who do you choose to govern you, or to who do you elect to make decisions for you at the larger scale. And I'm taking that as a segue to go to Dr. Tolpadi, because I feel in the field of political science as well, debates on making the right choice and how do you decide who is able to govern you informs a large part of the debate right now. So could you throw some light, you respond to them, but also your opening remarks on how politics and political science is informing the debate on education right now?
Shall I go over there? I'll be more comfortable.
Where? Yeah.
Shall I go over there? Yeah. To the stage? Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Please, sorry.
Good morning. I think it's still morning. First of all, let me thank the organizers of this program, particularly Abhilasha, for giving me this opportunity. I think this is a great opportunity precisely because I'm talking to teachers. Before I say anything, in fact, Shubhankar has asked me to respond to the earlier speakers, which I don't think I am capable of responding. I have a few points which I would like to place before you. And Shubhankar, you have to tell me when my time is over, okay? So 2 or 3 clarifications before I start. One is that given the time that is with me now, I don't think I can develop an argument. I require more time to develop an argument. So what I have is a few very sketchy points by way of reflection on the question of education. Not necessarily or exclusively on education, but on the larger world in which education is located. So that's one thing, the one clarification rather that I would like to give. And maybe, in the course of our discussion, we might evolve some kind of a perspective. So which is to say that I do not have a perspective as such. One of the reasons for which I think I'm terribly confused. To tell you the truth, I'm terribly confused. Ever since Abhilasha asked me to make some kind of a presentation, I started thinking about education, started thinking about what is thinking and what is rethinking, started thinking about what is elevating humanities. I mean, these are the 3 huge issues, because if you can spend time, I mean, you can spend a lot of time on this question as to what is rethinking and what is education and what is elevating humanities. So I was more and more confused as I started thinking more and more about this particular topic. Because this opens me out to a broad spectrum of issues. And I don't think, I'm confident enough, I'm competent enough, both confident and competent enough, to actually address all these issues. So therefore, some of these sketchy notes on this particular issue. Now, Shubhankar has asked me to contextualize. What is the context in which we live today, in which we need to think about education today? That is the point of my confusion. What is this time? What is this context? What is this world in which I and you live? More I think about it, more I am confused. But let me say that confusion is a very positive thing, because confusion would actually opens out a large number of possibilities. This confusion is not merely the actual empirical confusion about this world, but also more significantly, theoretical confusion. How do I understand this world? How do I relate to this world? And how do I relate myself to a large number of other, people who are located in terms of different social and cultural locations? And how do I, in this world, think about education? Think about values of education? What's the relationship between values and education? Should education have values or not at all? I think the contemporary world in which we live sometimes tell me that values are not required. Because it's that kind of a situation in which, values become redundant. So that's why, I would like to actually characterize what this world is in which we live today. Depending upon your different locations, academic locations, or ideological locations, you can describe this world differently. People say it's a post-globalized world. If 1992 is supposed to be some kind of a historical mark in which globalization has emerged, if you are a Marxist by conviction, you might say this is a post-capitalist world. If you are a kind of a modernist, you would say that's a post-modernist world. If you are a political scientist, as I am, I hope, you will say this is a post-behavioral world. So there are so many descriptions, And these are all not only descriptions. I think these are the different ways in which, you try to understand this world. The meaning of all that, in fact, meaning is the most problematic thing that I confront. The meaning of all this is that we are in a post-truth world. We do not know, or we cannot confidently say that this is true. And therefore, we should abide by it. Lots of post-colonial scholars or post-structuralist scholars would say that this is a post-truth world. You can't say that, what I say is true or what science say is true. I think, therefore, this is a terrible confusion in which I think all of us find ourselves, and if not, I think we would not understand the world, to the extent possible. That is to say that I think one need to get into this confusion as to what is it that we are living in and what is it that we are living for. People talk about artificial intelligence. Professor K.P. Rao is here, one of the greatest scholars that I have ever met. And after my discussion with him, brief discussion, I think I am much more confused. What is this artificial intelligence? And what is the meaning of the human subject once artificial intelligence, comes into the fore? It has already come into the fore, but, the question of meaning, who am I, the human subject, and the world in which I live? Unless we respond to this problem, I think our discourses on education becomes, impertinent. I don't know I'm making sense, but I think I'm trying to systematize, my confusion. And that, therefore, the world in which we live and the relationship between the kind of education that we pursue in this world, I think are closely related. People talked about critical rationality, critical reasoning, criticality. Now, I think at one point in time, the world, including India, believed at least during the 60s, I think, or the 70s, we all believed, that scientific reasoning, scientific rationality is the answer. It will tell us what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. But then we have now entered into a very different kind of rationality, which Habermas, an important scholar of the 20th century of the Frankfurt School, tells us this is instrumental rationality. The post-capital, or the post-global, context has created this. Or maybe, this was also something which, everyone responded during the 19th and the 20th century. The question of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad is determined in terms of the instrumentality, in terms of the usefulness. This is useful, therefore it is good. This is useless, therefore it is bad. I think it's a tremendous effort. It requires a tremendous effort for us to actually, get out of this instrumental rationality and get into what people have already spoken about, critical rationality. In fact, Habermas talks about it very lucidly, very clearly, very theoretically, very powerfully. So, therefore, if our education makes us more instrumental, more, in terms of, our material comfort. What kind of job I will get if I take this course? This is instrumental rationality. I don't know whether, one should completely get out of this instrumental rationality because, a lot of our thinking, I think, is grounded, in the capitalist culture, to which, we are terribly exposed. So how to move from this kind of a rugged instrumental rationality to, a critical rationality. I don't have any clear answer to this, but I think in terms of my reading, the answer lied in Gandhi. I think I should caution myself when I say this because I don't think Gandhi provides us a ready-made answer to the questions that we are facing today or to the problems that we are confronting today. But there is something in terms of Gandhi's approach to the world and Gandhi's approach to education, which I think we need to, take a very serious, rethinking of. So rethinking education, to my mind, as I understand it, should actually take me to not only Gandhi, but Gandhi is one reference point. I think to the entire, the entire experiments, particularly, in India, since, I'm a student of Indian thought and Indian politics, I think, from the 19th century onward, people like Savitribai Phule, people like, Pandita Ramabai, or in the 20th century, C.R. Das, Rabindranath Tagore. So there are a whole lot of intellectual traditions in India which begins to actually relocate education in the larger context of society and politics. That I think is the most important issue. That how are we going to make education something responsive to, something sensitive to what is happening around. On the other hand, I think education in the kind of education that we are in, I think is actually, in a certain sense, the product of the society. I think all education is product of society. But apart from that, I think education also has a role to play. It's an agent. It's an agent or agency of transformation. So if we are in a particular kind of education, which I would of course today say it's a neoliberal, neo-capitalist, education, I think even within this education, I think we need to rethink about what are the spaces of transformation. How do we make, this world a better world to live? Because that's my, huge problem. And I think, how do I, as teachers, although I am formally, retired from teaching, but I think I'm still a teacher. How do I relate to my younger generation? I feel, I'm terribly intellectually inadequate to answer or to respond to some of the queries with my son. Incidentally, I have a reasonably young son. He asks lots of questions and I don't have answers. How do I convince him that there is a normative world, there is a world of values, there is a universe of ideas, and that you need to expose yourself to? And I'm not able to do that. Because he is a typical, instrumentalist, pragmatic student of this age. So how do I say that? Look here, Gandhi talks about the, wholeness of life. Gandhi talks about the significance of practice. And that practice should inform theory rather than theory should inform practice. So how do I, communicate to the younger generation? And how do I become part of, the larger process of whatever you say, social change? I think the contemporary context of, the post-human, the post-truth world, therefore, I think is something that we need to very seriously contest, not to reject it, but I think, the post-colonial issues of truth, I think, are terribly frightening. So we need to actually, in terms of evolving, a nation-specific or a society-specific education, I think we need to address the larger theoretical, which are also political questions of our time. I don't know if I made any sense, but I thought I wanted to say whatever, I said whatever I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tolpady. Anybody wants to respond before I continue? Or can I? So if I was trying to make sense of what you said and what came before. And I think somewhere you said education is a product of this society, but it's also an agent. It's almost this, it has a dual purpose. It's doing something, but it's also a product of doing that. And in that, I also would like to bring in what Dr. Bhatt said about how modern education somehow has become almost, has assumed the role of an assaulter on native frameworks or indigenous ways or local ways of making sense of the world and educating. So in that we see that education today that we see in India, for example, as an agent is also contaminated by this native modern divide, and as a product, what we have, the system, is also a result of this hybridity almost. Like there is modernness to it, but there is also some localness to it. But it seems the local is always getting suppressed a bit, and that's where the power of the neoliberal, neo-capitalist system that has percolated this entire philosophy of looking at education, I think, has made its way, if I'm not entirely mistaken. So from this point, I would like to carry the discussion forward, and I would like to ask both of you, how do you then now see that if education is a product that we have as a result of some things that have happened to us as a society, but it's also an agent that we have in our hands. That's the active part of it, which we cannot possibly say that, we cannot cry over. We do have some active agency in creating more of this product. So how do we go about that? utilizing again, disciplinary perspectives or any other insights from your own fields?
So, calling it a product itself is little problematic, and I know you know it and you intentionally place it that way. It's a process. I would rather call it a process and not a product, because calling it a product scares me, because already, as Professor Tolpadi also mentioned, this is a very neoliberal order that we are discussing all this, and this is the major problem we see is this, like never before, entanglement of education with economics. Unless we are able to decouple these two. So that is how we have made education highly utilitarian, what is called also as instrumental rationality that drives any decision. What Dr. Bhatt also mentioned as to everything based on how am I going to be placed? How much, in fact, people approach us in the university, ask us about the program. Okay, what is the placement record of your institution? What is the package that the students are getting? If that is what is driving somebody to enroll into any education, of course it is product as you call it. But is there a way we reimagine it as a process of learning, of understanding our own surroundings in a much better way? It may sound very utopian, but isn't education supposed to drive us towards that ideal? Can we imagine it in that way that, of course, this rationality, as you said, this is something driving all of us. But can we pause, think, and reimagine it? And isn't it a time that we do it? And also do it with patience. When I say patience, I see patience as a virtue. So patience with self, patience with situations, patience with the society around or the structures around, and patience with social media. So patience as a virtue, and then it's only at that time we can take a pause, think, rethink, and come out with an imagination that is new, that is transformative, as Professor mentioned earlier. We need transformative spaces, and we cannot transform things in a day. So today we are all meeting, we are discussing, tomorrow things are going to be different. It doesn't happen. And that's where this kind of patience becomes very important for us to have as a society, not only as individual, even as a society, we need to have patience with time and see changes. As you mentioned, are we imposing? So we are still in that process. So our education system is in the process of relooking at itself, and there are problems, but even that as collective patience with which we can address. And I'm very happy that Abhilasha organized this conference, really imagined it very well, and then we're at least coming to have these conversations. And these conversations are a point of beginning, and a continued dialogue probably will take us in some direction. So with that, I just leave it to Dr. Bhatt.
Thank you, ma'am. The way I understand it, obviously it's a process, but looking at the practicality of everyday teachers, where our ideology is different from probably the ideology of the management, which is probably different with the ideology of the syllabus that has been given to us, and the ideology of the parents. Because if you try to do something differently, then the parent might come to you in a PTM and say, why hasn't my child got the marks? So looking at it from a practical point of view, taking patience ahead, educating the parents, I think is one of the most important things now, because education which is marks based has become deep rooted truth of education today. And the success, because we also need to see the commercial part of it, if the school is not successful, how will the school even pay the teachers? And how is the school successful? Enrollment. Enrollment based on marks. In fact, when you look at the NAC says progression, results, placements. So that means the evaluation of the success is based on these parameters already. And even when you look at the new parameters set by 2024 NAC, the same parameters exist in higher education, which is an extension of the, the UG and the early education. We cannot probably wait for the system to change because the policymakers have decided on certain parameters. So if we are looking at, okay, at my level as an individual, how can I work? Because if I'm going to harp and crib about the policy, I will be doing that and continue to be unhappy. So from my end, what can I do? Also the autonomy of the teacher in the classroom, because the teacher has to complete the portion, ensure that the teacher puts that level of skills which is needed for that classroom in spite of all the heterogeneity in the classroom. How do I do this? First thing is, I think we need to have more and more of parent orientation. Student orientation one side, parent orientation, because even the parents have to come out of the framework that marks is everything, skill is also important. And the skill, because we also see even in tier 2 cities, rural, the child is not involved. School ಹೋಗ್ತಿದೆ ಮಗು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಮನೇಲಿ ಏನು ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಬಾರ್ದು, ತೋಟದ ಕೆಲಸ ಗೊತ್ತಿರಬಾರ್ದು, ಏನು ಮಾಡಿಸ್ಬೇಡ. The child has to study. Homework is important. So probably educate the parents. Now I'm totally talking about in a practical point of view, nothing otherwise. Probably we need to educate, let the child work. It is not going to affect the child's education in any way. The child is capable. All of us are capable of this management, time management, everything. And then again coming back, children are like, we have these mirror neurons is what we say. That is, they assimilate what they see. I use my mobile and I tell the child, don't use it. You are studying, I am not. Now that doesn't work. So probably I have. If I give respect to education as an entity of learning, everything possible that includes even what is not in the syllabus, then having the discussion in the class, the child is going to be more open. If the class is limited to the syllabus, the child will assimilate the idea, only the syllabus is important, nothing beyond it. So can I use things other than the syllabus to try to understand the syllabus? Now that works if the parents are also okay with it. Tomorrow you don't want your teacher to be in the firing range just because the teacher has used other things. Yeneno matartiri ante class alli syllabus mugsad badlu, because this is what we usually see. So getting the parents on board, because let us not think about the syllabus and the policy, because that needs a lot of change, and we are seeing the change. Lot has already taken place. Probably patience is one thing where we'll need to wait for it to change. This is something, and also the management being open to give some bit of autonomy to the teacher in the way that the teacher deals with the classroom. As we already in the morning heard that we do not have one size fits all. So if I have 2 sections in second standard, what I use in this section doesn't work in that section. So probably you'll hear more noise from the other section, not because they are loud, but because the teacher is encouraging them to be loud, because that class has a lot of students who don't open their mouth at all. And probably their background is different, everything is different. So I think these are 2 things, more autonomy to the teacher and parent education is what I think is the only way we can, or rather my suggestion where we can balance our native thoughts and also looking at education in a more progressive way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhatt. I just want to do a quick check. What time do we have to conclude this session? At 1? All right. Yeah, sure. So we'll take Dr. Tolpadi's response and maybe open the floor for discussion after this.
I'm partly responding to Anita ma'am, also Mrs. Bhatt. But also something more to say. One is, they have raised objection to my word product, education as product. But education, they say, is process. I have no quarrel with that. But then even if you say it's a process of what? What kind of process it is? As a process, it is related to what? See, we quite often say that, we are the products of liberal education. I think most of us, maybe you are a neoliberal, but most of us are products of liberal education. And as products of liberal education, I think we inculcate certain values. We have certain ways of asking questions, and we have certain ways of responding and getting answers. So I think our intellectual, mental, makeup, I think is constituted by the kind of education that we receive. And in that sense, if I say that I'm a product of liberal education, now very proudly I should say that I'm a product of liberal education, because liberal education gives me, certain values. It tells me that there are certain values and that you need to inculcate them. But the neoliberal, instrumentalist, post-capitalist, it doesn't tell you that. At least that's my understanding. But my problem is, how do we now, in the contemporary context of education, say that, look here, these are the values. These are the values that we should inculcate. Even if you say that we need to, inculcate the value of critical thinking, what is critical thinking? And how critical is the critical thinking? How self-reflective is the critical thinking? So I think there is as I see it, there is a terrible value crisis in the contemporary context of education. And we are holding on to, certain values which we think uncritically that they are sacrosanct. We need to be ethical, we need to be moral, we need to be responsible, we need to, respect our parents. These are all fine. These are great values which, we try to inherit and cherish. But then, are these values sustainable today? Because postmodernity tells me that all that is solid. I'm quoting a phrase from postmodernity, a scholar from postmodernity. All that is solid has melted in pure air. There is nothing solid. There is no such thing as truth. So how are we going to confront this situation of philosophical anarchy? I think this is philosophical anarchy. I have a great respect for anarchy because anarchy opens out possibilities. But then, I would also, raise this issue, not as a conclusion, but I think, when we talk about education, we need to talk about how education has, for all these years, India or elsewhere, has subserved the dominant interests, has subserved the state interest. Louis Althusser, a Marxist, scholar from France, says that education is the apparatus of the state. That it is always almost, a ideological subservient of the state. And when, education is, like Nita, when they talk about models, yes, should we not take into consideration the question of what is the extent of state control over education, and how is it that in spite of all that, we need to actually envision a very transformative kind of an education. And on the basis of which, what are the kinds of values? Even if they are old values, I think rethought values, rethinking, is the title. So what are those values, which we need to inculcate? So this is my issue. Yeah.
Of course, yeah, I think this discussion needs more time, but because we have limited time, maybe we can take 2 questions quickly, and you please introduce yourself and address the question to the speaker, and yeah, I think we will wind it up. Any questions from the audience? Okay.
More than a question, I'd like to just make an observation. While we talk about utopian ideas of making a teacher autonomous, powerful, and all that, while one of the panelists was talking about the queuing up at the back here, which doesn't exist outside, it's because mediocrity is the order of the day. Wherever we turn, and specifically in the field of education, mediocrity should change. Therefore, I'd like to make an observation here to say, we have to make a paradigm shift from accepting only mediocrity. And I think that might change things in education. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm really very appreciate the point raised by Professor Tolpady. Actually, very touching points of that one. The main concept of that, the elevation of humanity or rethinking education. At present time, education is not happening. It is only qualification is happening. So his point of concern is where are the values? We don't have any values now. We are, as a product, we are preparing machines, not the human. So humanity has to be raised. So it's a very confused statement, or the confusion thing which is raised. Now this can be erased only and only by ethical values, and the moral values has to be inserted from class 1 till to the graduation as a compulsory subject. So as the earlier era as the sir said, before 60 or 70, the way how the humanity was, and after the 60 and 70, what the humanity is going on, are contemporary, very contradictory. The humanity is suffering more nowadays, but earlier the humanity was alive. So we have to really rethink about the education, not just giving only qualification. We have to think what education is, and it is a mere responsibility of all the educational institution and all there is a trust holders or educational system. It should be rethink to give the proper education, not only qualifying and preparing a product like as a machine going to earn for something. Thank you.
Because I completely agree with you, sir, but one point that I want to raise over here is when we say we want to add moral education and value-based education as a subject, the minute you bring it out in books and start talking about in terms of preaching, it will not reach out to the students. They will by heart and take it as another mechanism of marks. Unless it is an experiential, conscious evolution, moral education in classrooms is not going to work, because I have also studied and I don't remember a thing about what was taught in our moral education class other than getting bold. So I think if we are talking about moral education, because again, morality is quite, we are totally into the colonial consciousness when it comes to morality. Morality for me is different from someone else's morality. Values of me is different, and then it is quite contextual. So enabling and empowering students to choose the right morality and value needed for that particular context is probably more important than having a generalized textbook-based morality which is preached, which will not be assimilated by the children. I think make it more experiential, where the child actively involves in the choice is something that I think we should all be looking into. That is my observation for your observation. Thank you.
Okay, just one thing, just to add to what you said, Dr. Bhatt. So this is, how do you teach moral education is a different debate altogether. I mean, if moral education has to be a part of the curriculum, best thing is to embed it in different courses rather than offer it as a singled out course, which is also important that we keep aside some specific time for reflecting on certain things that we do on an everyday basis. In this direction, we brought out one book. I'm the series editor and I have a writer. We have done one book. It's called Growing Up with Nidhi. Nidhi is our protagonist. Last year, she was 6 years old, and now this year she is 7. We brought out the first book last year. It's called Nidhi and Minchu. Nidhi is our 6-year protagonist last year. And what we have tried in this book is to introduce personal ethics, relational ethics, social ethics, and environmental ethics, including a little bit about financial literacy. We have stories, around 15 stories, meant for a 6-year-old child. And it is designed in such a way that questions are raised with about, see, for example, we have one little story in that which is about Shop, Shop, Stop, Stop is the title of the story. And it's actually, if you look deeply, it's a commentary on consumerism. Okay, it's for a 6-year-old child. We are at least making a think, do you really need to buy everything that you see? So it has to be, I think the values have to be discussed. It can't be taught. It's again then that becomes highly problematic that what I believe is a value, what you know is not really a value. It's not like that. I mean, it has to be debate-based. It has to be discursive. And for discursiveness to be brought in that what we need, we may have to resort to a lot of such stories. And this year we're bringing out another book, maybe in December, where she's 7. And the situations that she deals with are a little complex. And not maybe too different from what she did when she was 6, but by the time, and every year we are going to bring up one book until she is 16. So this is how we are experimenting. I don't know whether it's going to reach people, but our intentions are sincere. And we hope someday I'll share a book with you. Thank you very much.
Professor Dr. Tolpady has requested a quick response, and maybe then we wrap up. Is that okay? Just question? Yeah? Can we take it? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question, please.
Yes.
Here, yeah.
Yes.
This question has been bothering me for ages together. As Madam Archana Bhatt said, we need to orient the parents regarding the marks. But what I normally see is parents are not wrong in wanting marks. Because once the child is 15 and completes its 10th standard, in colleges, they segregate children 90 and above, 80 to 90. So everybody wants that particular batch, which is 90 and above. So they are after marks. And when it comes to engineering colleges for placements, the 85% and above students are shortlisted for placement. Below that, they are not. So, somewhere marks are required, I feel. I do not know. Maybe the system needs to change. It's not just the parents. Somewhere there is a problem. That needs to be changed, what I always feel. Thank you very much.
The entire panel discussion, it has in a way invoked certain perspective in each one of us. I appreciate all the panelists because each one of them have broadened our perspective. First of all, that critical rationality, moving from instrumental rationality to critical rationality is a beautiful point. So also the aspect of process, madam, I think that also has significance. We need to think education as process, that aspect. And practical dimension. We need to take into consideration, we need to inform the parents, the management also being open. One beautiful aspect I liked is pausing. See, it's not like we impose everything or we have a syllabus to finish. If we don't pause, I don't think we give space for humanity. Or rather, we don't give space. In every class of ours, there should be pauses. There should be place for children to reflect. It's not just pouring out everything. There should be questioning. There should be pauses. And somebody said, the value education. Of course, value education is required. I'm not disagreeing. There should be moral. But I think what is also important is the entire ethos of the school. So much is taught to the children because they see what is happening in the entire school, how the entire school is conducting itself from morning till evening, how the teachers are conducting themselves, how the entire process is going on throughout the year. And at the end of their education, they can proudly say, I am so and so, belong to this school. I have imbibed these values. So it's not that we cannot devalue or lessen the importance of giving moral education. That also has a place. But I am also emphasizing that entire ethos also is important, and also critical thinking in the classroom where pausing is important, reflective questions are important. My one question to the last person, that is Ms. Archana, but you said progressive education is embedded with our cultural beliefs. I'm saying we need to take it, we should not break. It's true, I agree with you, a lot of it. But madam, I want to say, aren't we, or should we not also be critical? Certain times we need to be critical of also our cultural belief. Sometimes taking in everything as it is right, it is ideal, sometimes land up in trouble to us. So we need, don't you think that we need to be critical of also the beliefs that we are brought in? Thank you.
A quick response to Madam Neeta. I have no problems with the kind of categorizations of ethical. But then, what actually, we continuously talk about value education, moral education, whatever, ethical values in education. But then, when we do that, are we giving sufficient attention, intellectual, theoretical attention to the content of that ethical education? For example, to me, today, the question of how a student or a child negotiates across diversity of classes and communities. Because we are in such a situation of hatred that it is, the other becomes the enemy. So how are we going to, evolve a trans-religious secular ethic on the basis of which, a child is, asked to include the other, negotiate the other, trust the other, love the other, rather than the hate the other. Because the other becomes the point of hatred in today's education, at least in coastal Karnataka, as I see it. So therefore, I think when we talk about ethical education or value education, I think the trans-religious secular ethic, the idea of the trans-religious secular ethic, I think is very crucial. Yeah.
Would you like to respond quickly, ma'am? Yeah.
Just a response to that. Yes, it's very true. When we talk about critical thinking or just questioning and curiosity, it is for both sides. Our modern education also, what the teacher is talking about, and my own native education. So it is the child, as you said, sir, has to be nourished intellectually so that the child knows how to make this educated choice as to which part do I, and it has to be an educated intellectual choice, not a forced choice, and not a shallow choice also, because it's very easy to put down both modern education and our own native education also. It's very easy to put it down. So we do not want that shallow choice, because shallow choices lead to very short-term satisfaction and long-term confusion. and confusions to the level of my own identity being questioned by myself, leave alone others. So I think enabling them, that's why I use the word enabling and empowering children to think. I think thinking and curiosity are two things that we have to nurture now. So this is the only thing that I wanted to say.
Yes, I think syncretism is non-negotiable, and yeah, so that space, what Professor says, beyond religious beliefs and ecosystems, one needs to think and imagine oneself. And when we talk about moral imagination, it does include that kind of a moral agency where an individual choice also becomes very important. I mean, I think we have debates to get into, including Amartya Sen, the theory of choices and things like that, more of an academic debate, but definitely syncretism when it comes to is non-negotiable, and therefore I think the people here, what we witnessed today, even syncretism was also something very, very visible, and I think so that's how things are, and I don't want to elaborate more on that. Yeah.
All right, so I think I'll take the opportunity to sum up. We all agree that patience is required in this field, and we also need a pause, as you say, pause for maybe some food, and the discussions can continue with all of you over lunch. Yeah?
Thank you, dear panelists. We had really wonderful session. So on behalf of everyone present here, I would like to express my gratitude to our panelists for their time, wisdom, and commitment. Let's take the insights shared here as motivation to elevate not just ourselves, but the communities and the world around us. As we wrap up this discussion on Elevate Humanity, we are reminded that meaningful change often begins with small, everyday action, whether that's showing kindness or simply practicing empathy in our daily lives. Each of us has a power to make a difference. Now, I would like to request Mrs. Mujida Anjum, Principal of Peace Public School, to kindly present the memento to our esteemed panelist, Professor Rajaram Tolpadi, in recognition of our appreciation. Thank you, Madam. It's my pleasure to request Mr. Girish Kumar, Principal of Podar International School, Mangalore, to present the memento to our eminent panelist, Dr. Neetha Inamdar, as a symbol of our heartfelt gratitude. Thank you, sir. May I humbly request Dr. John Thomas, the Principal of Little Rock Indian School, Brahmavar, to present the memento to Dr. Archana Bhatt, our distinguished panelist, symbolizing our deepest gratitude and appreciation. Thank you, sir. May I request Mrs. Sushma Dinakar, the Principal of Sharada Vidyaniketan Public School, to present a memento to the moderator, Mr. Shubhankar Paul, as a token of our profound gratitude and respect. Thank you, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, a delicious lunch has been arranged for you on our school campus. There is a humble request to all attendees. Kindly refrain from bringing your personal vehicles. To my right, our school buses are arranged to take you to our school campus. Alternatively, for those who prefer to walk, there is a shortcut route to my left side that goes to our school campus, and our teachers escort you to the campus. We request you to assemble sharply at 2 p.m. for the next session. You may take 5 minutes to use the washroom and freshen up before boarding the bus. Thank you, and we wish you a delightful afternoon.